The date was April 30th, 1975, when North Vietnamese troops and tanks rolled across the streets of Saigon with President Nguyen Van Minh surrendering. The fall of Saigon, now named Ho Chi Minh City, brought an end to a war that had consumed Vietnam. Nearly 4 million Vietnamese and more than 58,000 Americans were killed in the war. The new government estimated the bombing destroyed two-thirds of the villages in the south, leaving 10 million refugees, more than 1 million war widows, and some 880,000 orphans. Joining us now in Washington, D.C. is Jim Laurie. He's the only American television correspondent to witness the fall of Saigon and currently a senior consultant with CCTV America. And with us from Los Angeles is Viet Thanh Nguyen. He was just 4 years old when his family fled South Vietnam in 1975, and he's author of the book, The Sympathizer. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Let's start with Viet in Los Angeles. Viet, great deal of turmoil when that war ended. Of course, the Americans were defeated and they were trying to evacuate people out of Vietnam. They were trying to withdraw from that war. You were 4 years old, as I just mentioned. You and your family managed to get out of the country. How did that happen? Take us through that.
Well, my family was living in a small town in central Vietnam called Ban Ma Thuột, which had the distinction of being the first town overrun in March when the final invasion began. And my mother was there with my brother and myself and my adopted sister while my dad was in Saigon on business. So when the town was captured, she had to make a life and death decision about what to do. She decided to leave with my brother and myself and leave my adopted sister behind to take care of the family property because she thought the war would just go back and forth as it had in the past. And so she walked downhill 120 miles to the port town of Nha Trang. We caught a refugee boat to Saigon, caught up with my father, and then a month later had to catch another refugee boat in April when the communist invasion finally reached Saigon.
Jim, you were a correspondent at that time for NBC News, the American network. What was the scene like outside the U.S. Embassy on the morning of April 30th, 1975?
Well, the morning of April 30th for me began actually some days before. I had been evacuated from Cambodia with the Khmer Rouge bearing down on the Cambodian capital. And I went out by helicopter then, turning around, coming back into Vietnam, vowing not to leave by helicopter the second time. So by the 29th of April, that's when things began to get a little scary in Saigon. First, there was an effort to bring as many Americans with Vietnamese colleagues out of the country by fixed-wing aircraft from Tan Son Nhut Airport. But the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong launched an attack on the airport with rocket and artillery, and that plan was scuttled. All of a sudden, everything went to the U.S. Embassy in downtown Saigon. And beginning late in the morning on the 29th, this nearly round-the-clock operation continued with people leaving by helicopter. By the following morning, I watched it 8 o'clock in the morning as the last helicopter left the roof of the American Embassy carrying U.S. Marines. At that point, everything went crazy around the U.S. Embassy.
That's right. We remember the pictures of that mad scramble of people trying to get out of the country. Viet, you got out. What about other members of your family? Were they able to get out as well, or did you have to leave them behind?
Well, most of the people we left behind, as I mentioned, my adopted sister was left behind. I didn't see her again for another 30 years. My father didn't see his own family again for 40 years because the country had been divided in 1954, and my parents had been living in North Vietnam in this small village, and they fled, along with 800,000 other Catholics who feared communist persecution, to South Vietnam. And then my mother, leaving in 1975, wouldn't see her own relatives for another 20 years. So this is a very common story, Vietnamese families being divided, broken up, people leaving behind all kinds of relatives for decades at a time.
Jim, once there was the realization that the Americans had left, things started to get a little bit ugly in Saigon, outside the U.S. Embassy there. Let's play a clip of your reporting at that time. Let's watch this.
The U.S. Embassy behind me has been completely looted. The South Vietnamese obviously are angry at the American withdrawal. Many of them have said that they were left out in the evacuation. They were unable to make the helicopters. Many of them were American employees. They have had to stay, and they will now have to stay and cope with communism in South Vietnam.
So at that point, was there resignation that communism had arrived?
Well, the first thing was the Vietnamese, I think, were very frustrated, angry. They felt the Americans had deserted them. An orgy of looting, as I said, began in the embassy. Everything was taken apart. People were desperate to get out, and some people came to me. I was obviously very visible, as you could see in that clip, as perhaps the only non-Vietnamese in the crowd that morning. And people were coming to me asking for help in getting out, showing me their American IDs. I think it's also worth noting there were a lot of rumors going around. I think the Americans purposely were telling people falsehoods. They were telling them that if they were to fall into North Vietnamese hands, their women would be married off to disabled North Vietnamese soldiers. If you wore fingernail polish, your nails pulled out. All kinds of rumors were all over the city, which would precipitate this sort of panic.
You know, you talk about people who came up to you, I guess literally begging you to help them get out of the country. I'm going to play another clip of an exchange you had with some South Vietnamese outside the embassy. Let's take a look at this.
You don't want to stay here in a way.
I understand the Americans are gone.
Yes, I know that, but I must come in case, just in case.
But there's no way because all the helicopters are gone.
Can you help us?
There is no way I can help because we are staying here. We are staying in Saigon.
So you were the bearer of very bad news there for the people trying to get out.
It really was heart-wrenching. I mean, I had left Cambodia and also leaving lots of friends behind. As it turned out, a much worse situation in Cambodia than Vietnam. But this exodus, which began on the 29th and 30th, was the beginning of 20 years of people leaving Vietnam. And in fact, it's been more than 2 million people during that time left the country for other places around the world.
Viet, you have subsequently returned to Vietnam. What was that experience like for you?
I've been back to Vietnam 5 or 6 times in the last decade, and I think it's been a transformative experience because, like many Vietnamese people who've left the country, I was afraid of going back. I didn't know what I was going to find, and there are many Vietnamese people who have never returned after leaving Vietnam. And what I found was, a country that was beginning in the early 2000s when I returned for the first time, trying to get back on its feet and turning itself into a capitalist society, and a country that was marked by all of the excitement and tension that you can imagine from being a poor country trying to turn itself into a rich one. And what I also found personally was, a difficult emotional situation where many of my relatives were poor, and there were tensions between them and myself, which is indicative of how it is that for many of the Vietnamese people, there continues to be tensions between the Vietnamese who stayed behind and the Vietnamese who left.
So is there a feeling then, Viet, that the wounds of that war, that lengthy war, have not yet healed?
In some ways, yes. I think many Americans who return are amazed to discover that the Vietnamese, many of them have forgiven them and want to move on. But that's not the case in the same way for the Vietnamese who stayed and the Vietnamese who left. Many of the Vietnamese refugees who left were called puppets and traitors by the communist government. And they are associated still with this idea that they weren't there to participate in the difficult times of rebuilding the country in the decades afterwards. And also, there are many overseas Vietnamese people who continue to be opposed to the Vietnamese Communist Party and are trying to maintain political pressure from the outside about questions of religious freedom and human rights. And this, of course, causes further tension with the government in Vietnam.
Jim, in all those years that you covered Vietnam, what stands out in your mind?
Well, in the particular period where I stayed behind, what was so extraordinary at first was the normalcy that quickly returned to Saigon. We were quite surprised by that. And yet there was this gradual tightening by the communist authorities, which again encouraged more and more refugees to leave. Then you had the phenomenon of the re-education camps, where many of the backers of the old South Vietnam government, the Americans, were put into incarceration for anywhere between 5 and 17 years, and some never made it out. But for me, I've been back to Vietnam many times. I started to go back in 1979. My most recent visit was in December of this year. So I've watched it progress from a very fearful society to a much more open society today. They began to change in the Communist Party, at least their reforms began roughly in 1988. And so we've seen that progress. To one of the points that Viet was drawing on, there is a contradiction. My wife is from Vietnam, and she has been going back since 1985. On the one hand, Viet is absolutely correct. There is this suspicion between the people that believed in Giải phóng, or liberation, and those that consider April 30th a day of shame, those people who were on the losing side. And yet, the Viet Kieu, the overseas Vietnamese, have been heavily invested in the economy and have built, in many respects, the Vietnamese economy, which we see today.
And this is a bit of a personal question I want to ask you. Your wife is Vietnamese. How did you meet?
Well, the irony is, while I was in Saigon in those final days, she was getting on a boat just down the street on the Saigon River on the 30th of April and going out to the South China Sea on a South Vietnamese naval boat and picked up by the U.S. Navy off the coast. She was among the first wave, as Viet was, of the refugees leaving the country. We met many years later in Los Angeles because she became a NGO worker helping other
So you didn't know
Vietnamese
each other
refugees.
in Vietnam?
Didn't know in Vietnam, met in Los Angeles many years later.
Viet, we mentioned your book, The Sympathizer. It's received a lot of praise. It's received great reviews for telling the story in the voice of the Vietnamese people. How critical was that to you, that the Vietnamese people's story had to be told?
One thing was really critical because when I was growing up as an American in the 1980s, I was absorbing enormous numbers of American stories about the Vietnam War through political reportage, president speeches, novels, historical accounts, and films. And most of those were overwhelmingly about the American experience, even though for me as a Vietnamese refugee, it was clear that this was a war that was as much about the Vietnamese, if not more so, than about the Americans. And yet the stories that I was hearing from my family and from other members of the Vietnamese community weren't being heard by Americans. And so it's just so important for Vietnamese Americans, overseas Vietnamese people to be able to tell these kinds of stories. I'm far from the first. I'm far from the one who's telling the only Vietnamese story because, as our conversation has been making clear, there's more than one single Vietnamese experience.
Yeah, I wanted to just quote to you one review, which was in the New York Times. It was a review done by Philip Caputo, and he wrote, "This tragicomic novel reaches beyond its historical context to illuminate more universal themes, the eternal misconception and misunderstanding between East and West, and the moral dilemma faced by people forced to choose not between right and wrong, but right and right." What was your goal in writing the novel?
Well, when I looked at the war, what I saw was that the tragedy involved how people of all sides really believed in what they were doing. Each side had a legitimate political belief that they were on the right side. And this is what leads to tragedy, when both sides believe that they are doing the right thing. And in the novel, my protagonist is someone who's able to see the situation from both sides. That's why he's sympathetic. That's why he's a sympathizer. It's his great insight into the human condition that lets him see why people do what they do. But it's also going to be his great downfall, because in the end, wars are driven by people who believe in only one thing. And it's easier for people to believe in only one thing.
Jim, in going back to your reporting in Vietnam when the war ended, did you ever, at any stage, you decided you were going to stay behind? Everybody was trying to get out, but you decided, with your crew, I would imagine,
My
to
cameraman
stay.
was a man named Neil Davis,
Right.
who was 15 years older than I and was a real mentor to me. He knew his way around the war. He had been in Vietnam since 1963. So I had a certain level of confidence in him. The next 24 days that we were together were at times scary. We went down to the Central Market where the North Vietnamese troops were burning books, so-called bourgeois books. They didn't like us filming the book burning. So they lowered their AK-47s and marched us back to our hotel. A few tense moments, but overall, it was a learning experience, but not a dangerous experience.
How long did you stay after Vietnam had fallen?
I stayed 24 days, left on the 25th day. Neil Davis, my cameraman, stayed for 3 months.
And Viet, how do you see Vietnam unfolding now? Its development, its economic development. I mean, you mentioned that it's turned into a capitalist society. We know that it's doing very well. It's seeing good growth rates. What do you see coming up?
Well, it is growing really fast, and that is a boon in some ways to the economy and to the people who benefit from it. But it's also starting to see a lot of problems, including the vast gap of inequality between the people who have money and the people who don't. And ironically, even though it's run by a communist party, it's oftentimes the Communist Party cadres and government officials who are the ones benefiting from this economic inequality. So I think Vietnam has a lot of issues to work out in terms of how to address economic inequality, how to address the problem of political freedoms, and how to address the question of religious freedom, which is one of the most divisive issues in Vietnam today. And then finally, of course, it's China. What to do about China's expansion into the South China Sea. And the Vietnamese people are very tense about that because they have a deep nationalist sentiment that puts them against China.
Right.
But the Vietnamese Communist Party is aligned with that.
Okay, we're going to have to end it there. Viet Thanh Nguyen joining us from Los Angeles. Jim Laurie with me here in the studio. Thanks to both of you for being with us.